an email to the list, right? I mean, with the new URL.
Oh,
you're not
yes.
changing anything.
Yeah, I know. I was just putting it out on social media. I'll also send it to the list right now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Okay, then let's just get started with this week's Sociology Department Seminar Series. And today we're very, very happy to have our very own colleague, Holly Reid, here to give us a talk about their paper. It's a co-authored paper with our own Amy and also Sofya, who is also here already. And then this paper is about our own CUNY situation. It's about undocumented students and on our CUNY campus, and then how they cope with the situation and how the staff, our own CUNY staff is facing those situations. And as we all know, Holly is our professor of sociology at the Queen's College, and she's also a doctoral faculty member in sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center. Let's welcome Holly to give us this talk entitled Managing Illegality on Campus at CUNY, Undocumented Mismatch Between Students and Staff. So Holly, it's your floor.
Thank you, Hsin, for that introduction. Let me just see if I can share my screen. Here we go. Okay, everyone can see? All right, so it's really great to be here to talk about the results of this research, which was funded by the William T. Grant Foundation. And I just want to thank my co-authors, Sofya Aptekar, who's here today. She's from the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, and our own Amy Hsin from Queen's College Department of Sociology. Unfortunately, Amy can't be here today, but Sofya is, and she's around for the Q&A since she is our co-author who has the most expertise in qualitative research, which is what this paper is about. I'm glad she's here today. I also wanted to say, some of you might recall from the department that a few years ago, Amy and I presented some of our quantitative findings from this mixed methods project, which is kind of a long ongoing project. And so I'm really happy to be able to kind of report back on some of the newer findings. I'm really happy to answer clarifying questions during the talk, but if you have really long detailed questions, maybe we can save them to the end, because it is kind of a little bit detailed, some of the findings. So in case you have to leave early, I just want to preview the findings for you. So this is from a paper that's forthcoming in the Harvard Educational Review. And in this paper, we're drawing on qualitative in-depth interviews with undocumented and documented students and CUNY faculty and staff in order to develop the concept of undocumented mismatch. This highlights the multiple points of tension that we find between students and staff around the experiences and management of illegality, which I'll discuss in a moment what we mean by that. And we really found this in three different areas. One had to do with identity and the intersectionality of race and legal status, which resulted in the exclusion and alienation of non-Latinx undocumented students on campus. The second point had to do with stress around the issue of students disclosing their legal status. And the third had to do with issues and challenges around data confidentiality on campus. So I'll just briefly give some background, including some of the previous research, but also just background for those of you who are not familiar with some of the recent changes in terms of undocumented people in the United States and undocumented students in general. And then I'll give a little bit of New York City and CUNY specific context for anyone who's not familiar with that. I know a lot of us here are, but I think we have a really unique context for this research, so it's important to highlight that. Then I'll present our research questions and our research methods. And then after discussing the findings, I'm going to talk about our conclusions and also how they relate to the impact of the crisis in public higher education directly. So for background, first of all, for those of you, this is going to be well known for those of you who follow immigration issues, but if that's the case, just bear with me. US immigration policies and the many decades that we've spent without reform of the immigration system in the United States have resulted in a category of people who are undocumented. They do not have legal status to reside in the United States. They do not have legal status to work in the United States. Undocumented immigrants come to the US via two major pathways. Entry without inspection, which is frequently border crossing. And this is the thing that gets the most coverage in the news, of course. But more commonly, undocumented immigrants come to the United States on a visa, and they just overstay their visa. That's the most common path, in fact. It's estimated by the Migration Policy Institute that about 1/4 of all foreign-born residents in the United States, or around 10.5 to 11 million of the people, are undocumented immigrants in the United States currently. The other issue that we were studying a lot has to do with DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, because many of our students and some of our staff do have DACA status. This is a program that began under the Obama administration in 2012, and it allowed undocumented youth who met several criteria to be considered for temporary relief from deportation or from being placed in removal proceedings. It's often called temporary legal status. It's not true. It doesn't provide legal status, but it just prevents people from being deported. But it does allow for legal employment, which is quite important to allow people the ability to work legally instead of working on the black market, right? It's estimated, again, by the Migration Policy Institute that about 591,000 current DACA recipients in the US, but they estimate this is a small percentage, only a little about less than half of the estimated 1.3 million who are potentially eligible. And under the Trump administration, DACA was halted in terms of being able to first-time applicants to apply. It was under attack, but the Biden administration has reopened the program this year to first-time applicants. So if we focus in specifically on undocumented college students, I'll tell you a little bit about who they are. It's estimated about 25,000 undocumented students enroll in college every year. This is about 1/4 of those who graduate from high school annually, so a small percentage. Those who do enroll in college are highly selected, and some of the research Amy and I have done found that they do have better average high school grades than their citizen or even legal permanent resident peers or than citizen peers. And so even though they're highly selected, they face a lot of barriers to achievement and to completing their college degrees. They're often ineligible for government financial aid, although this has changed in certain states, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. They're frequently working to support their families, and of course, they're facing threats of deportation, stigmatization, and alienation on campus. And they lack information about resources or networks available to them, and may fear asking for help or disclosing their legal status in order to get help. We use the term illegality in this paper, and I just want to clarify that we are not calling these students illegal. No human is illegal, of course, right? Instead, we are referencing work by Shannon Gleason and Roberto Gonzalez that refers to the way in which the state criminalizes migrants and draws focus to legal structures that position undocumented migrants for exploitation. And we're really trying to underscore how migrant students experience illegality and/or the perception of others that they are illegal. And the fear, lack of access, and manipulation that often accompanies their legal status or their lack of legal status. We are also in this paper exploring how university faculty and staff perceive students' legal status and how they understand and try to meet these students' needs. So again, this concept of undocumented mismatch we develop in the paper came to us through these multiple points of tension between undocumented and documented college students, those who have DACA, right? And CUNY faculty and staff around these three themes. One is the intersection of race and legal status, the racialization of students, and the exclusion of non-Latinx undocumented students from many spaces and programs. The second is the stress that students experience and the tension with faculty and staff around disclosure of legal status. And third is the challenges around data confidentiality. So New York City is a special context and part of the uniqueness of our study. We're really adding to the literature because many previous studies have focused on California, which has a huge immigrant population, a huge undocumented immigrant population, but they are primarily Latinx, although not entirely. But many previous studies have also really focused on Latinx or Mexican American students because they are such a large group nationally. But New York City has a much more diverse undocumented immigrant population compared with a lot of other places. And we have lots of different countries of origin among our undocumented immigrant population, just like we have lots of different countries of origin among our immigrant population in general in New York. We have undocumented immigrants from diverse places in Latin America, so not just Mexico, but also South America, et cetera. We have a lot of undocumented immigrants from places in the Caribbean and Asia, among other places as well. And I'll show you some statistics about our specific populations at CUNY in just a moment. New York City also has a moderately favorable political and policy context. The New York City government has taken some steps to minimize cooperation with ICE, the immigration enforcement arm of the federal government. But some programs, and they do have some programs that have been open to undocumented immigrants, such as NYCID and other programs to provide resources and support. But there is still aggressive policing that targets people of color in New York City. And there is still some continuing cooperation among the police department, even if it's less than it previously was with ICE. In terms of deportation. So CUNY, of course, reflects the diversity of New York City. And as most of you know, at CUNY, we serve over 275,000 students on 25 distinct campuses. And we've also been suffering from years of public disinvestment, which impacts the working conditions and pay for faculty and staff. It results in a lack of resources and crumbling infrastructure on many campuses, and constant and increases in tuition and fees, which obviously affects the students. Undocumented students can access in-state tuition rates in New York. They have to provide a notarized affidavit in order to do so. And then the New York State Comptroller estimates that about 4% of all CUNY students are undocumented. You can see here in this table from the CUNY administrative database that we used for some of our previous quantitative research, there is a real diversity in the CUNY undocumented population. So 35% are from Latin America, but although a significant percentage of those are from Mexico, there are also large percentages from Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. Over a quarter of the undocumented students at CUNY are from the Caribbean, many from Jamaica, from Trinidad and Tobago, from Guyana, from the Dominican Republic. Almost a quarter of CUNY undocumented students are from Asia. This includes students from China, South Korea, Bangladesh, India, and other places. And we also have significant proportions from other parts of the globe, including Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. As I mentioned, undocumented students can access in-state tuition rates, but during the time of our study, there was no state financial aid. So we did our interviews in 2018 and early 2019, but in mid-2019, the New York State DREAM Act was passed, and thankfully students were able to start accessing state financial aid, but during the time of our study, they did not have access to that. There are programs and outreach on some CUNY campuses, but they vary quite a lot in terms of their approaches and the resources that they have available to students. I found when I was doing interviews with faculty and staff that it was often the job of one person on campus to work with undocumented students. They were frequently, this was the job of the Dream.us scholarship coordinator. They were sort of added more responsibilities onto their job beyond the scholarship coordination, and expected to host workshops or to be a point of contact for undocumented students on campus. Staff really vary widely across different campuses and across different offices and on campus in terms of their knowledge of and their training in immigration issues. So I found some staff members who were really self-taught and read a lot of different policy and research about undocumented students and about immigration issues in general. And then I found others who were almost completely unaware of the issues. Students may or may not be aware of and or able to access services and programs. And what we found in our study is that many of the students who volunteered to participate in the study and to participate in the interviews actually did not know who to contact on campus or how to get access to resources, services, and programs. So our main research questions, one having to do with students and one having to do with staff. So we wanted to know, how do undocumented students, both with and without DACA status, manage their illegality on campus? So do they feel safe on campus, especially after the 2016 election? How do they access resources and support? And what are their interactions and relationships like with faculty, staff, and other students? And then likewise, we wanted to know, how do college staff and faculty manage the illegality of students while organizing programs and providing support? How do they understand the needs and characteristics of the student population they serve? And how do they conduct outreach, design programs, and interact with students? And what are their challenges and constraints that they face in doing this work? So I'll talk about, briefly about our research methods. Again, from 2018 to early 2019, we conducted in-depth semi-structured interviews with 105 students and former students who are or were undocumented while attending college. And we also conducted interviews with 35 faculty and staff members. And all of these were across various CUNY campuses, both 2-year and 4-year campuses. We used interviews were recorded and transcribed, and we used Atlas TI to do both open coding and analytical coding of our transcripts and to code from both our original research questions, but also to identify themes and inductively. And data confidentiality was one of those themes that came forth inductively. So I will talk about that as the last point of the undocumented mismatch. You can see here, this is the breakdown of the student interview sample by country of origin and race. And it just really emphasizes the huge diversity of backgrounds and racializations that we have among the student population at CUNY, and also that really was clear and evident in our student interview sample. And I think both Sofya and I would be happy to answer more detailed questions about methods and so forth at the end if people are interested. So let's get to the meat of things, the findings. So The first finding really had to do with identity and the mismatch between students' feelings of the intersectionality of their race and their legal status versus the way that staff and faculty perceived it. So students, there is a diversity, as we showed, right, on campus on CUNY colleges, but Latinx youth actually were stigmatized as undocumented. They felt they could not pass as documented the way that some other racial groups could. Asian, Black, and white youth were less likely to be stigmatized as undocumented and more likely to be thought of as having legal status. So it made it a little bit harder for them sometimes to disclose their legal status, the fact that they were undocumented, and to get supports that were connected with those things. Students who were not,
I just want to clarify what you said. Did you say that non-Latinx students were more likely to think that they could pass as documented, or that they were less likely to be personally aware of their legal status situation?
No, they were aware of their legal status situation, but they were, others assumed that they were documented. It was less likely that they were stigmatized as undocumented. Yes. Students who were not Latinx reported that they felt unwelcome or not included in discussions and workshops about issues for undocumented students or in campus dreamer clubs and organizations. What happens is that campus outreach and services for undocumented students are sometimes located in Latinx settings, and such as the Mexican Studies Institute at Lehman is a place where people can go for assistance if they are undocumented, but that can really compound this problem, right? Because you don't think that that they're speaking to you, right? If you are not a Latinx student. The other issue is that the term dreamer is sometimes used as shorthand by staff and faculty, but not everyone is a dreamer. First of all, not everyone is a DACA student. And even some of the undocumented students who are dreamers don't embrace that term. They don't like that term. So it kind of can create another point of exclusion for students who do not identify with that or who do not have DACA status, right? If you see something advertised for DACA students, you figure, well, I'm not able to go to that. That's not for me. And then on the other hand, the sort of mismatch occurred, right, is that even though we had some staff who work with undocumented students and who are really aware of the racial and ethnic diversity of the population of undocumented students, they still may not be successful in their outreach because of stereotypes about who is undocumented. They may think that they have a great idea of who is undocumented on their campus, and they may think that they're already reaching everybody, but in fact, they're really only reaching people who have disclosed to them. We found with conversations with staff revealed that some of them still believe that most undocumented students are Latinx and that all undocumented students are dreamers. So not all staff felt that way, but there were definitely some who believed that. We also found in some cases the use of sort of diversity happy talk, which celebrated the racial diversity of the students they were serving, but without acknowledging that there were a lot of structural inequalities to unpack, and that those things were really affecting things. And also, you know, the idea that you're oh, we have such a diverse group. Yeah, but these are underprivileged students who are facing a massive amount of barriers, right? So it's not a great thing that we have more of them, right? So that was kind of an issue in some of the interviews. Other staff, as I said earlier, they really have self-educated themselves and they recognize the nuances and differences across different groups of undocumented students. But I would say that was the exception rather than the norm. The other thing is that Stereotypes can shape institutional investment in programs and clubs. And as I said, when non-Latinx students felt excluded, sometimes staff placed the burden on them to organize their own spaces. So I'll just give you a couple of quotes. This was one from Carlos, who's a staff member at a four-year college who worked with outreach and support programs for freshman students. And he said, I actually do have a pretty good diverse student group. We have Asian, South Asian, probably Africa is more where it's not so much represented, but we have a couple of students that are. I want to say the majority of the students are from some kind of Latin descent, either Latin America or the Caribbean, but it's not overwhelming. There's a very good mix. I've had some European students from Israel, not sure why Israel's in Europe in this quote, and other European countries as well, Poland. I have a very mixed crowd, which is something I'm proud of because I think too much we see immigration as a Latino face. So I'm very glad when we can show that diversity and that this is not a Latino thing, this is a world thing. Well, on the one hand, right, it's great that he was serving such a diverse crowd of students. But on the other hand, you know, he was serving students who were in need of extra services, right? So I mean, it's kind of this a little bit of like, well, yay, diversity, right? Without really thinking beyond some of the structural issues that are affecting these students who are undocumented. This was a quote from a student. Julia is a Middle Eastern undocumented student, and she said that her peers racialized her as white. She said, I know that we have the dreamers on campus. I'm not a part of them, mainly because the one time I went to an event that hosted undocumented students, or that was for undocumented students, I think it was right after the election. It was more tailored to exactly what Trump was talking about. So Latino migrants and people. And I understand they're a big part of the undocumented community, but they do cut out all the rest that are not of that ethnicity. And she said that this event featured a Latinx speaker who was an undocumented success story, who led the room in a Spanish language chant. And Julia chanted along, but she did not know what it meant, and she did not feel part of the group. So the second theme that we really found was a mismatch between students and staff and faculty had to do with legal status disclosure. Many of our participants who were participants in our interviews did not disclose their status to anyone on campus. And this was often due to fear. And you know, you can understand this, particularly after the 2016 election. The fear was very heightened. And you can imagine the being afraid to disclose your own status, right, to anyone on campus, especially if you did not know them well. Some students reported that they felt pressured by staff and faculty members, that they felt vulnerable after they reported their legal status, or they had negative experiences with disclosure, even receiving sort of negative or stigmatized comments from faculty and staff after they disclosed their legal status. However, on the other hand, there were many students who did receive help from advisors and faculty after they disclosed their legal status. So for some of them, it was a positive experience and it allowed them to access resources or to feel supported. But the other interesting thing we found was that some students didn't disclose their legal status to access resources or to get something. It was really related to their desire to build community with other students who were undocumented. So they wanted to find other people who were in the same boat as them. They didn't have that support network, and they wanted to find out how they could be part of that group and that community. So the staff and faculty, after Trump was elected in 2016, CUNY scrubbed the legal status from the CUNY databases, from CUNY First and so forth. So staff and faculty could no longer observe who was undocumented and who was not. And this was done in the name of data confidentiality, which we will see in a moment had some adverse effects as well. Therefore, staff after 2016 could only know those who were undocumented if they disclose their status, but they seem to assume that they will. Because they think, oh, well, there's scholarships available, there's resources available, and they are eligible for certain funds and so forth that are available on campus as long as they come and disclose. Yet we found that was absolutely not the case, and many of the students in our interviews had never disclosed and did not know how to access resources on campus. And that may have been part of the reason that they participated in the interview, was to get access to some information. Many staff and faculty placed a normative premium on disclosure of legal status, because not only did it give students access to resources, but they also focused on the sort of activism and the pride of being out and proud of being undocumented, right? And this idea that we had to all fight together and be strong, right? And it sort of fed into this narrative of being an undocu ally, to also believe that undocumented students were fighting for their rights, right? However, sometimes conversations and the interviews with staff revealed that they were potentially coercive in pressuring students to disclose, and they kind of wouldn't take no for an answer. They kept on trying to figure out a way to get a student to disclose their status so that they could then get them access to resources. So they had a good reason for doing so, but you could imagine in that setting that students might feel very vulnerable. So if you take a look at the next slide, you can see a couple of quotes from on the left from a student, Kiana, who was age 31 from Jamaica. She said, "So I think because I didn't know, because I was so afraid about my status, I did not. I was scared to talk to anyone about like anything." And so this student actually didn't know how to what the impact of revealing her legal status would be, and whether it was helpful or whether it would be met with some stigmatization or something worse, right? So she was afraid to disclose. And then you can see that on one of the staff quotes, Kim was a staff member at the two-year college working with an academic support program for underrepresented students. And she said, "I feel like I want to support my students that feel courage, that are courageous enough to say, this is who I am, this is what I need from you. And I don't feel like I get and I understand the other side of it, but I think there's this level of fear mongering that people play on. And I have a responsibility to my student and to society to do the right thing. Even if that's scary, I think that it's important. It's important enough if something comes up, I'm willing to fight for that cause." Well, it's not just fear mongering, it's real fear, like, because you could be deported, right? Or your family could be deported. And so it's nice that Kim is an undocu ally and that she believes in the abilities and the strength of these students, but she's not putting her own life on the line, right? She is not the one that's going to be deported if something happens, right? So it was a little bit disconcerting to hear some of these things in the interviews. Another example comes from some CUNY advertisements and so forth. So you can see on the left a flyer that was advertising the CUNY DACA scholarship. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's a scholarship that's available to everyone, any CUNY student, regardless of immigration status and everything else. But as you can see, it's housed in the Lucero Institute, the Mexican Studies Institute at Lehman. And, the pictures of the students who are represented here who receive scholarships, they look like perhaps they might all be Latinx, right? So if you're a student who's undocumented and you're not Latinx, you may see this and say, oh, well, there's nobody that looks like me. And this is from the Mexican Studies Institute, so maybe I'm not eligible for this, right? You might just take a quick glance and not feel included. The second is an example from, the Thursday brief from the CUNY newsletter, where they are really focusing on DACA students here, right? And there are a lot of workshops through CUNY Citizenship Now, through campus organizations, focusing on how to apply for DACA, how to renew your DACA status. But it really makes non-DACA students and those who are ineligible for DACA feel excluded as well. And then one more thing that we found also was that some students who received scholarships or who received assistance, they were sometimes pushed into doing sort of public-facing activism and being the face of the scholarship, posted on a website or something like that. In order to receive this support, it seemed like a quid pro quo, right? That you were kind of forced to be out as an undocumented student, even if you didn't feel entirely comfortable with that, in order to get the scholarship. And there's been some writings on this, that are, you might want to take a look at the work by Cabrera, which focuses on this in the California context as well. So finally, the third theme that came out in terms of undocumented mismatch had to do with data confidentiality. And we were not entirely surprised, but a little bit surprised at how much this came out in the discussions with staff and faculty. Students had this pressure to self-disclose their legal status to campus staff in order to qualify for in-state tuition and to other potential benefits and services which were aimed towards assisting undocumented students. Many campuses have a special fund where they can help undocumented students with short-term financial issues. So staff may not be aware of a student's legal status, and students may not be aware of the potential benefits and services. Once again, the burden is really on the student to manage their own illegality on campus and to determine whether or not and to whom to disclose their status, who could be an ally. They have to really tread that, and it's a very fine line, and it can be very fraught. Concerns about data confidentiality and status disclosure became even more relevant after the recent passage of the New York State DREAM Act, because you can imagine that, yes, now people are able to get services, but now their name is in a database somewhere, right? So this is something that students were not always completely aware of, but one reason that many of them did not disclose legal status was to avoid being tracked, right? And to avoid being potentially put on a database somewhere. Staff are aware of the order. Every staff member that I talked to, with the exception of maybe one person, was aware that CUNY had scrubbed the databases and that you were no longer able to look in CUNY first and find a student's legal status. Is there a question? Sorry.
I have a question, but maybe it's better for after. Just, I wanted your personal impressions as you were going through this study and observing firsthand. I mean, you always sort of put yourselves in the shoes of your subjects, right? Was there ever a time in real time where you were like, man, if I were in their shoes, I wouldn't put myself on this database? Like, your personal appraisal of the vulnerability that like they were putting themselves into in real time by putting on themselves on a database when politics wasn't settled. Like, now it seems like it all turned out fine and they had nothing to worry about in retrospect. But like, when you were watching them in real time.
Yeah, I mean, we encountered this actually, as researchers ourselves, because our original plan for this research was to use the CUNY administrative data and to draw a random sample of undocumented students from that data and contact them to participate in interviews. And when Trump was elected, we threw that out the window because we were terrified that even though we had an NIH certificate of confidentiality, and even though we followed a lot of very strict confidentiality procedures, we were terrified that we would be subpoenaed and forced to, or our data could be seized. And so we decided to go about recruiting students through flyers on campus and through snowball sampling. And frankly, I think it worked out better because I think we reached students we wouldn't have necessarily reached otherwise because they weren't disclosed in the database, right? So I think, but yes, I think we should talk about this more in the Q&A, but it is a very good question because I do, well, I'll tell you just now, right? So the part of this next point is that some staff that I talked to admitted to me that they kept their own secret coded databases to track these students. And they emphasized to me that they were going to great lengths to protect this data, right? So they were saving it under names and file names that had nothing to do with undocumented or immigrant or whatever. They were keeping it in file folders that had nothing to do with that. But, and they wanted to identify and help these students, but they also were being sort of pushed by the university, the neoliberal university structure, right, to record their own productivity. How many students did you reach? How many did you serve, right? And as we know, most staff who work with students are not trained in data security and confidentiality procedures. They don't go through IRB. They don't take ethics training the way that faculty should be doing, right, when they're doing research, right? So we can't be, I was not convinced that these data were secure. And I am pretty, I would be pretty not surprised, right, that they could be subject to legal search and seizure potentially. Let me just give a little bit of conclusion here, just a couple slides, and then I'll open it up for discussion and questions. So again, the undocumented mismatch really we found across 3 different themes between staff and students. First was identity. Again, Latinx youth were stigmatized as undocumented. They could not pass as documented. Asian, Black, and white youth sometimes were assumed to be documented, but that made them less likely to disclose their legal status and get support. Staff were sometimes unaware of diversity, and they based their understanding of needs on those who asked for help or who disclosed their status. Stereotypes about who is undocumented tended to shape institutional investment in programs and clubs. And non-Latinx students felt excluded, and some staff placed the burden on them to organize their own spaces. The second theme had to do with status disclosure. Staff assumed and normalized legal status disclosure, and sometimes they pressured students to disclose. They placed a real normative premium on disclosure and activism, and students sometimes regretted when they had disclosed their status. And some of them were disclosing to meet other undocumented students, not to access resources. And then the third theme was about the confidentiality of data. The removal of student immigration status from the CUNY databases unintentionally resulted in non-secure staff-created databases to track undocumented students. The data are not comprehensive, they're not secure, they might be subject to legal search and seizure. And students are generally unaware that these databases exist. And then finally, I'd just like to link it back to the crisis in public higher ed. There are an increasing number of jobs and student support services that are contingent part-time labor. These staff are really, have very little job security. The expansion of corporate management of the university and the emphasis on productivity and monitoring efficiency, it really directly relates to the non-secure record keeping of undocumented student lists because staff are being asked to prove their value by how many students they've served and what sorts of outreach and programs they've created and how many have attended, right? So that sort of productivity and efficiency monitoring really led to this data confidentiality issue, I believe. Staff work under increasing workloads, eroding pay and job security. We all know that who work at CUNY. And job performance is often measured in quantity rather than quality. A lot of staff and faculty were still struggling to build caring relationships with the students they serve. And I think most staff that I spoke with were really trying their best to do the best job that they could to support and help their students. But a lot of them were also struggling with their own challenges because of this eroding pay and job security. And so it's not an ideal environment for student services to thrive. Some undocumented students themselves were exploited by the university to promote the public image of the university as a diverse and inclusive place. And meanwhile, we have a lot of other students, many of whom were part of the participants in our research, who were flying below the radar and who really lacked access to resources and supports because they did not disclose their legal status. So I want to thank you for your time. And if you have further questions beyond the Q&A, I'm always happy to answer by email, or we can set up a Zoom. But I hope we can have some discussion now. I hope I left enough time. So.
Thank you so much, Holly. This is such a fascinating research. And I mean, I myself, I used to be an international student holding F1 visa, and I'm still trying to wrap up my head around this fact that some students, overstaying their visa will be qualified as an undocumented student, right? If that's the case, okay, if that's the case, I can't believe, because I was watching this chat and I see many people are asking, why wouldn't they disclose? Why are they so afraid? This is fascinating to me, because all my education, I mean, I don't know if there is any difference based on where you come from, or like which particular non-immigrant group you belong to. But at least speaking from the Chinese international students' perspective, the most important thing we learned even before we came abroad is that it's super critical to maintain a legal status in the United States. Otherwise, you will be deported. Otherwise, you will face a lot of sanctions, and then you will be denied visa forever, and you won't be able to come back to the US forever. And this is still the biggest fear for, I mean, speaking from the perspective of international students, it is still our biggest fear. Like, if you overstay your visa, this is probably the worst thing that could happen to us. So then they got deported still. So I mean, this is just more of like a comment, and I see a lot of people are already raising their head. So let's open the floor to the audience. Okay, I see 3 people raising their hand right now, and let's just go by the order on my screen. Is that okay? So the first one will be Anna.
Thank you so much for such an important talk. I have a question, but I just wanted to fill in a little bit. I appreciate your comments that you just made, because I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed, because this was way back in the dinosaur period. I remember being an undergraduate, and my citizenship status was called into question, and I had to supply all sorts of documentation. There wasn't any organization that could help you. There wasn't like a university office that was really skilled and helping you with all of this stuff. And I just remember, even though I was a citizen, just being so, I don't know, so terrified. So I guess that's why I sound a little bit rattled. So I certainly, can appreciate, the situation of, these students. So yeah, it was a terrifying experience. So I guess this brings me to my second question, I'm wondering if this is available, if this has already been published, and I'm wondering what kind of communication or how this information is going to be presented to the relevant offices at our college. And I'm thinking, like, for one thing, even like the new dean of diversity, and trying to, I mean, I just think that this is information, that people need to know. And especially the idea that we need to improve how students come to understand, access information about programs that are available to them. I'm sorry, that was a whole lot.
No, that's okay. It's not quite published yet. We're actually in copy editing right now, so we're almost there. It's a little bit longer of a process these days. I don't know why with the pandemic, but thanks. I will be happy to share the article with people when it's out. Should be soon. And in terms of presenting this back, Sofya and I actually did a talk at the CUNY Faculty and Staff Diversity Conference in the spring, which was really well attended. And I hope that some of that knowledge and so forth went back to those who can use it, right? But I think you have a great idea, and I would be, I think that's great. We should pursue talking directly with the new diversity office at Queens, but maybe at other campuses as well.
Right.
I also am sharing back with the faculty and staff directly who I talk to, and we do, Sofya reminds me, we do have a list of policy recommendations. I didn't share those because it's a little different audience today, but and I didn't want to run out of time, but yeah, we do have a list of things that we've been sharing. Yeah, I think that's all. I want to say more about Queens, but I'm not going to. So
I appreciate it. Okay, thank you so much.
All right, awesome. Our next question will be coming from Annie.
Yes, quickly, because I know there is so much anxiety, so much interest. This is fabulous. I don't have any words to congratulate for the work you have been doing. As you know, I've also done work on the Dreamers. Quick question, because my latest work actually is on stigma. And you mentioned, and I missed part of the discussion at the beginning about how undocumented students, particularly Latinos, are highly stigmatized. Quick question. How is that stigmatization taking place? Self-stigmatization, staff stigmatization, how is that working against or in favor of identifying students? In many ways, I was thinking how stigma works, that is not one-way street, that if you stigmatize someone, at the same time, you are labeling that person and making that person visible. These are the contradictions of the stigma.
Yes.
So you don't have the time. I know that it was not about stigma, but I felt that it's such an amazing field that allow us also to create policies, because again, label and stigma go hand in hand, and it can be used also for good reasons. Go ahead.
I think I'm going to punt that one to Sofya because she's our expert on the students. But yeah, I think you're exactly right that it's a double-edged sword, right? Or I don't know, it could be positive and negative in some respects. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Anai. So nice to see you here. But
nice to see you. Thanks for coming.
For some of our Latinx respondents, they told stories of being teased and bullied from elementary school on and called illegals, and even talked about their friends who were born in the U.S. who were also, Mexican American or Latinx, but specifically Mexican American in many cases, or Central American, just being just brutally bullied in school by their peers. And so, they certainly were aware very early on that they were that undocumented people existed, whether or not they understood the specifics of their situations. So that by the time they come to CUNY, sometimes, having experienced that makes them approach seeking assistance and disclosing status in a different way that somebody who's gone through, K through 12 system always, being assumed to have U.S. citizenship or even being born in the U.S. So that's kind of the role that racialization played in what we saw with the students.
Thank you, Sofya. And I probably joined you too late. You had already presented, right?
Oh no, I just I presented today, but Sofya's here because she was, we did a major partnership in this work. So she was kind enough to agree to come for the talk. So
Okay, thank you. You're fabulous. I'm a big follower of the work you're doing.
Thank you, Ani. Thanks.
Same here, same here. And Ani, if you think you missed anything, you can check back on the YouTube live, the YouTube channel. I think we will have the video there, so you can check the first part if you missed anything. All right, so our next one will be Joe. How are Joe? Okay, Joe.
Hi. I have a couple questions. The first one was, I find it, first of all, I really love this idea that help became racialized because it looks like the job of organizing against DACA fell to sort of ethnicity centered institutions and groups. And I'm wondering, like, why do you think it went that way? And like, it's odd if you think about it in a way, but in a way it makes sense, like that an ethnicity group might be the backstop or where the organization is allowed. Like, why did it happen like that? Is my first question. And then the second question has to do with sort of sort of the judgment call involved in outing yourself as an undocumented person and the wisdom of doing it in the context. Like, it panned out okay. So in retrospect, it looks like it was a good idea to have these kids out themselves and whatever, because the battle was won. But had they rounded up all those kids at some point, had politics taken a different break, then all of that organizing would have looked like a terrible idea in retrospect. And I'd like to hear your comments on that aspect and what you sensed in real time.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my comment on why sort of Latinx spaces or ethnic institutions became the space for organizing around DACA or organizing around undocumented students. I mean, I think it has to do with the broader politics of undocumented immigration in the United States, which is very driven by the Latinx community because they are the largest group. But in the New York context, it doesn't make as much sense, right? But I think what happened is sort of the Dreamer National Scholarships were focused in particular offices on particular CUNY campuses. And because they are mostly associated with the Latinx community, somehow it got associated with that. And that person who was in charge of that, they were not always Latinx themselves, I will say, right? And it really depended on the campus. So not the case at Medgar Evers, for example, right? Because the majority of undocumented students at Medgar Evers are from the Caribbean, right? So, it does really vary. But the Dreamer Club at Medgar Evers is heavily Latinx. And when Caribbean students said, well, I don't feel comfortable there, I don't feel like I belong, they were told, well, you can start your own club, right? So this is like putting the burden back on those students. But it is a really good question as to why that became the case. And I will say that some of the people we interviewed were a few of the staff and faculty that I interviewed were very aware of how this looked, and they were trying to figure out ways to reach students beyond the Latinx population.
If I can jump in to add a
yeah,
couple
please
go ahead. I don't know if you're done. But also, like, it's indicative of the way the CUNY system works more generally, right? Offloading things to individual campuses, like, right, every campus is deciding its reopening policy and things like that. That's part of what's happening. There is not like centralized CUNY policy in any of this stuff. So it falls to usually staff doing more work than they're paid for because they care. And it's very uneven across campuses. In what information is available and what services are available for these students. And in terms of, but the larger question of different ethnic communities taking up like DACA advocacy, actually my paper with Amy that is already published on Chinese undocumented youth. One of the things that we find is that there's such a focus on the asylum seeking pathway as, as difficult as it is for the people undergoing it, that there is really very limited, if any, advocacy in New York City among Chinese American, Chinese immigrant organizations around DACA or even being undocumented. So people don't even necessarily identify themselves as undocumented youth or a dreamer or DACA or any of these things because they are identified as an asylum seeker. So there is no advocacy or very little in those communities.
I will say also, I remember from one interview that with a service office that helped people with applications for DACA and so forth, that they talked about how word of mouth really is the way that people learn about stuff. It's and so groups would come in waves, right? So you would have a lot of Colombians show up for a few weeks, and then all of a sudden you'd have a lot of Polish immigrants coming, and then all of a sudden some Bangladeshis, right? And so it really is this word of mouth. And I think the Chinese example is a really great example because the whole focus, right, is that how can I get my asylum application approved, not how can I get DACA status or how can I get become a legal permanent resident only through the asylum pathway, right?
Yes, I mean, as a Chinese myself, I will say I never heard of a lot of discussion on this. And oh, okay, I see Ryan have a more question. I will save my question for later. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, thank you. I love the talk, and I like this idea of intersectionality and adding this immigration status to the discussion. And I've just done some stuff in sociology of work stuff, and they've always kind of talked about immigration status as another kind of element that, you know, puts workers at risk and makes them more vulnerable to exploitation and things like that. So I think this is really interesting to think about it in terms of just student life, you know, instead of just a work prospect in general. Did you have any other kind of interactions with things like gender? I mean, did students that were male or female have different kinds of experiences? Maybe male students felt more stigmatized than female students. I mean, I know this is like asking you to do extra research here and kind of adding a whole dimension, but did any of that come across in the, and maybe class too, but I think gender would be kind of interesting to look at in terms of the status interacting with that for the students' experiences.
Oh, you want me to take that?
Either one.
Yeah, I mean, let me think. I mean, it's a very good question. I don't think we've examined it fully yet, I guess. It's a good question. Yeah.
I mean, not in terms of what Holly is presenting here, but in our work that's more focused on just students and their, you know, coping and survival strategies. I mean, definitely we live in a patriarchy. So what we do see pretty consistently is the pressure on the female students to marry for status, much more so than on the male students. Even though in a lot of cases that would not do anything, because if you became undocumented by crossing the border without inspection, then it is actually very difficult to get status by marrying a US citizen. It's much easier if you are a visa overstayer. But we do see that, you know, women face that pressure from their families and kind of like their future marriage, you know, what it's kind of like everybody's status in their family is like pegged to that future marriage and what it can bring. So some of them do feel considerable pressure in their dating lives that they resent.
That's interesting.
Harry, do you have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me? Am I unmuted yet? Again, terrific research. That if and when students reported any kind of bad consequences for having revealed their immigration status, what were the bad consequences that they that had to happen to them? And did anybody report experiences with police that had somehow affected their status or or even their morale, I guess?
I mean, some of the consequences had to do with sort of negative comments they received from staff after they disclosed their status, you know, and just feeling vulnerable and scared. I'm gonna have to ask Sofya about the police thing. I could talk about it from the perspective of the faculty and staff, but I know that you did have students who did have negative experiences, either themselves or family members with policing. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of the first part of the question, the consequences was also like usually because of scholarship, being pressured to, you know, be like the face of dreamers at Hunter or wherever. And then like, now I want to apply to law school. My name and face are plastered all over the internet and everybody knows I'm undocumented. Why, you know, like people are like, that was a very bad decision. But I kind of didn't have a choice if I accepted this money that allowed me to go to CUNY in the first place. We have some really nasty racist colleagues. Yeah, at CUNY that, you know, students report like really horrible things said to them or said about them in class, or, you know, said about undocumented people in class and around the election. And I think Baruch is winning in a bad way for this stuff. But with police, yeah, our Black male respondents reported, and some Latinx respondents, especially darker skinned ones, reported negative interactions with police, being harassed by police, you know, a lot actually around like fare evasion in the subway.
Yeah.
You know, kind of had their experiences were similar to people who weren't undocumented, you know, as we know in New York City. And some Latinx respondents had like siblings or other family members who were facing like deportation proceedings that could be traced to interaction with police over things like, you know, smoking pot in public and, you know, things of that nature.
Yeah, I had a couple of faculty or a couple of staff members who mentioned to me that they had heard from students that they had observed ICE officers at the transit stop near the campus, and they were very fearful and the staff member had said, you know, they then went and talked to the campus security and tried to make sure that they were aware not to allow those guys on campus. But, you know, if they were undercover or something, how would you know, right? So it was those kinds of questions. But then another student story that came to me via a staff member was that her mother had been arrested for fare evasion on the bus, and she actually didn't realize she had evaded the fare. She was on one of those, fast buses, right, where you're supposed to pay for the ticket before, select service, right, where you're supposed to pay for the ticket before you get on the bus. And she didn't realize, and she was then detained. And luckily she was not arrested, but she then was like terrified that she was going to be deported for months after that. So there are a lot of negative experiences on the streets of New York that our respondents, you know, and that undocumented immigrants are experiencing every day, right?
Yeah, just to piggyback on what I've been said here, I think this is such a fascinating research, and I think one thing that is really fascinating to me is that you've seen so many variations within your sample, right? There are variations along like the country of origin, where do you come from, and what is your race, and then perhaps in the future you can include the gender dimension, but there are like just a lot of variations. And I think one more dimension that is very relevant to what we're saying here is, I'm just wondering, is there like, so those undocumented students in your sample, the majority of them are actually survivors in the sense that they are not facing any sanctions yet, right? Or like, at least they're not being deported. They're still here, right? So I'm wondering, who are those used to be undocumented students, but then they really got deported even before we're able to reach them. So who are they? Are there any difference or like very systematic difference between that group and this group who can still get by here? Maybe it's very hard to get into contact with those who are already not in the US anymore. But I'm just wondering through snowball sampling or something like that, maybe you can reach out to some of them who really get deported. But this is just one thing. And another thing is, I'm wondering, from a purely methodology perspective, the way you recruit the sample, I just imagine those people, they have a higher sense of security. I mean, my assumption is they must be having a higher sense of security such that they feel safe to talk to you about their identity or about their legal status, right? For some of them who are really, really scared, would they be willing to talk to you? And again, who are those people? Are there any sampling bias? If this recruitment is through this type of word of mouth or snowball sampling, would there be certain systematic bias there, such that certain people who will be more scared to talk about their legal status to anyone, and then they definitely wouldn't reach out, perhaps because of language barrier, perhaps of I don't know, just
if a co-ethnic came to me, I would tell them not to talk to anybody, including researchers. If they were like, how should I deal with this? I would say it's in your interest to completely stay off the radar under all circumstances.
Can I jump in quick because I have to go at 1:30 to another meeting? We did not recruit through snowball or word of mouth. Right? The number one way we recruited was through flyers on. Amy went to like almost every CUNY campus and put up our
a lot of them too. Yeah.
And you did, Holly, too. And so that's why we were getting people who don't disclose status. Like a lot of them were like, you're the only person I've told other than like my family knows, right? And of course there's selection problems. So I imagine many were like, why would I talk to these randos? Who are they and who are they gonna tell? But also students told us like, this was a relief. It was a relief to have someone listen and for me to say all of this. And we did do a lot of work to inform the students of all the steps we were taking to make it safer. It's never absolutely safe, but we did have the NIH certificate of confidentiality. We did explain how it worked to the students. And of course, they could quit anytime and all of that. And we really had a lot of positive feedback after the interviews in terms of how they experienced that. But yes, of course, there was selection. I have to go to my next meeting. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Sofya, for coming.
Bye, Sofya.
Thank you so much.
What's interesting about this case is that its story can be told in two completely different ways that are almost draw the opposite morals. Like you can see this as a story of how the tragedy is that some people were denied help because it became racialized and only Latinx students were involved in the social movement. And so the tragedy is all of the kids who were left off. A completely different way to view this is that there were some cultural entrepreneurs in the Latinx community who were using these students and, creating these big social movements that outed them, that could have been catastrophically bad for these kids. And they were lucky that it panned out okay. But it's funny how the same story can look like a tragedy, be written in two ways, where either side is the tragic victim.
I think that second point is exactly what a lot of the literature on undocumented students sounds like, Joe, which is that it's positive and everybody's an activist and everybody's out and proud and everybody's fighting for, legal status. And that's exactly like you said, we did not find that among our participants, and in general, and I've been to the Dreamer conference at CUNY and it is fantastic, right? It is an amazing experience. I urge you all to go. However, those are not the majority of undocumented students. So I think that's the message that we're trying to get across, is that there's a lot more diversity in terms of both race and ethnicity, but also in terms of people's experiences and their status disclosure, right? So, yeah.
Totally. Charmaine?
Hi, everyone.
Hey, nice to see you.
I have a question. Sofya mentioned about the NIH and confidentiality. Holly, what if it becomes what if you ask to reveal this confidentiality you have with these undocumented students, are you at liberty to do that or say no?
I mean, in theory, the NIH certificate of confidentiality prevents, by going through the process of applying for that, it would prevent us from being subject to legal search and seizure. I don't trust that that would have been the case if Trump had been in office. I don't think it would have held. You know, I think we would have been in a position like journalists are, right, about not revealing our source, right? You know, I think the three of us were willing to make that stance, but I know exactly what you're saying. There's no guarantee, right? There is no guarantee.
Right.
The
What do you
research
think?